In these times of crisis between Russia and the West, French President Emmanuel Macron was a welcome guest in the magnificent Kremlin palace with his colleague Vladimir Putin. Putin has valued the President Macron for 5 years not only as a mediator alongside Germany in the Ukraine crisis. The head of the Kremlin always has an open ear when it comes to Russia's interest in Europe. When the two met again in person for the first time today, when I'm filming this, yesterday for you, after 3 crisis calls, it was supposed to be about reducing tensions in Europe. Putin should particularly like the fact that Macron first visits him in Moscow and only then travels to Ukraine. Chancellor Olaf Scholz here from Germany will again visit Kiev this week and then Moscow. There was too little dialogue with Russia last year, Macron said in an interview before his departure. Russia's current confrontation is not about Ukraine, but about clarifying the rules of cooperation with NATO and the EU. At a recent meeting with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban in Moscow, Putin complained that NATO, the United States and the West were not taking Russia's concerns about its own security seriously. Putin's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov recently said that everyone in the West is concerned about Ukraine's interests, but nobody in the West is concerned about Russia's security concerns. Moscow has repeatedly emphasized that it sees itself threatened by NATO and US arms in Europe. Macron should once again hear from Putin that Moscow would not accept Ukraine's admission to NATO without resistance. Putin has recently made it clear several times that what is at stake is nothing less than a new security architecture for Europe. Well, seen in this way, the deployment of Russian troops along the border with Ukraine is seen primarily as a muscle flexing with which Moscow is emphasizing its demands for security guarantees. The Kremlin has been denying allegations by the United States that it is actually preparing for an attack on Ukraine for weeks. Russian state media wrote that the US was frightening the whole world with its hysterical warnings of war. A visit by Macron to Putin could do a lot to ease the tension. And before Macron's trip, the Élysée Palace emphasized the close coordination with the EU partners, above all with Chancellor Scholz. Macron phoned US President Joe Biden, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, and several times with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. It is about a uniform, coordinated announcement to Moscow with clearly defined consequences in the event of aggression, it is said in Paris. Macron's intensive mediation in the crisis coincides with the start of the hot phase of the presidential election campaign in France. He has not yet declared his expected candidacy for a second term. But a visit to Moscow as a crisis manager shouldn't hurt, even if no breakthroughs are to be expected. Macron wants to campaign in Moscow for a revival of the peace plan for eastern Ukraine, negotiated with the help of Germany and France. The president explained that a lot had already been achieved through the dialogue over the past few days, so that the situation would not escalate any further. Macron said he wanted to find answers to the acute situation in Moscow, but also to move in the direction of a new order that Europe urgently needs, based on the principle of state sovereignty. From Moscow's point of view, the answers are clear. We don't want a war, that's what everyone in the Kremlin is saying, but after years of eastward expansion, NATO cannot trample on Russia's interest either, as Minister Lavrov once put it. Putin's catalogue of demands for more security in Europe, which has attracted a lot of attention from the US and NATO, has been rejected in the main points. However, the Russian political scientist Dmitry Trenin said in a round of talks at the Moscow think tank Carnegie Center that Putin had achieved quite a bit with his diplomatic, what he called shock therapy. Above all, there is again a dialogue between Russia, NATO, the USA and the EU. And according to Trenin, no one in Moscow seriously believed that NATO would withdraw from Eastern Europe and its 1997 positions as Putin had demanded. The fact that Russia's concerns are now being addressed in the West is an important diplomatic success, he says. Trenin is convinced that the USA will not risk war because of Ukraine and that NATO will not take the country either. Carnegie expert Andrei Kolesnikov said that Russia's fear-mongering is primarily aimed at gaining respect. But Putin cannot gain anything by shedding blood. There is no mobilizing effect in society. Rather, the invoked danger of war and the threat of sanctions from the West alone exacerbated the economic problems in Russia. The rating can no longer be improved with war. The German Bundeswehr presence in Lithuania could be doubled against the background of tensions with Russia. Foreign Minister of State Tobias Lindner from the Greens said on Deutschlandfunk on Monday that there would be up to 1,000 German soldiers. A decision on increasing the quota should be made in the next few days. That means around 500 Bundeswehr soldiers are currently stationed in the NATO country as part of the Western military alliance's so-called front presence. Lindner pointed out on Deutschlandfunk that a doubling of this contingent could not be interpreted as a serious threat by Russia. Should this happen, then that would be propaganda, said the Green politician. And Lindner said that in the past there were German contingents of 800 to 1,000 soldiers in the Baltic states. Such a magnitude is being talked about again, and I assume that the decision will be made in the next few days, he said. The Minister of State emphasized that the principle of rotating NATO troops should be adhered to. He said, no units will be stationed permanently in Lithuania or any other Baltic state. And Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Defense Minister Christine Lambrecht had previously announced an increase in the Bundeswehr presence in the Baltic states. However, they had not yet decided on the details. Germany also regularly takes part in NATO airspace surveillance in the Baltic states and in Romania. Negotiations to save the nuclear deal with Iran continued in Vienna on Tuesday. This was announced by the EU, which is coordinating the talks on Monday in Brussels. The diplomats recently interrupted the 8th round of negotiations for consultations in their capitals. The coming weeks are seen as crucial for the possible restoration of the 2015 deal. Germany, France and Great Britain, together with Russia and China, have been mediating between Iran and the United States for months in order to save the 2015 deal. The aim is to lift US economic sanctions and, in return, to restrict Iran's nuclear program again in order to prevent the development of nuclear weapons. Under former US President Donald Trump, the United States unilaterally withdrew from the agreement. Tehran, for its part, then expanded its nuclear capacities step by step. The head of the Euro Rescue Fund, ESM, Klaus Regling, calls for a permanent pot of money from which Euro states can be provided with loans in emergencies. The Euro area needs a permanent pot of stability so that there are no full-blown crises, Regling told the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung on Monday. This would give states access to cheap loans, for example, if the unemployment rate rises significantly or growth collapses. The loans could be granted by the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM, for example. The demand is controversial because for many EU countries, including Germany, an EU financing instrument like the Corona Development Fund is a one-off thing. The Corona Recovery Program is financed by taking on joint debt at EU level and comprises more than 800 billion euros in inflation-adjusted prices. Regling also called for the Stability and Growth Pact, which stipulates how much debt EU countries can take on, to be relaxed. Increasing the euro debt limit would make economic sense, he said. He proposes raising the debt ceiling from 60% of the gross domestic product, the GDP, to 100%. He also wants to relax the deficit limit of 3% of economic output. It should apply in principle, but governments should be allowed to exceed it in individual cases, for example if the EU Commission diagnoses an investment gap. German Federal Finance Minister Christian Lindner said at a meeting in Brussels in January that fundamental changes to the EU debt rules were unnecessary. And I'll see you in my next video. Bis gleich.